She was just the African nanny, but she woke up in the Arab executive's bed. Everything changed. He fell in love. She was just the nanny, but that morning she woke up in the Arab executive's bed, and everything changed. What happened that night, and why couldn't he let her go? Stay until the end to uncover this shocking story. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Amina never imagined her life would take such an unexpected turn. When she left Kenya for Dubai, she had only one goal: to work hard and send money back home to her family. She had been hired as a nanny by one of the most powerful men in the city, Sheikh Khalid Al Fayed, a name that commanded respect in every business circle across the Middle East. Khalid was a man of wealth, discipline, and untouchable power. He had built his empire from the ground up, expanding his family's legacy into $1 billion business. But there was something missing in his life, something that not even his wealth could buy. His world was cold, calculated, and void of deep emotional connections. Amina had worked in his mansion for nearly a year, caring for his 5-year-old son, Omar. The child had lost his mother in a tragic accident, and since then he had become quiet, withdrawn, desperate for warmth. Amina, with her soft voice and kind heart, had been the only person who could reach him. At first, Khalid barely noticed the nanny. To him, she was just an employee, someone taking care of his son while he handled multi-million-dollar business deals. But slowly, something began to change. He started to see the way Omar's eyes lit up whenever Amina entered the room. He noticed how, for the first time in years, his son was laughing again. He admired how patient and gentle she was, how she treated Omar with the kind of love that no amount of money could buy. And then he started noticing her. Her presence became impossible to ignore. The way she carried herself with quiet dignity, the way her dark, radiant skin seemed to glow in the Dubai sun, the way her laughter filled the halls of his otherwise lifeless mansion. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, unpretentious, strong, and undeniably captivating. But he refused to acknowledge these feelings. She was the nanny, nothing more. That night, Khalid returned home later than usual, exhausted from negotiations in Abu Dhabi. He found Amina in the living room, sitting on the floor with Omar, reading him a bedtime story. She didn't notice him at first, too focused on the little boy resting against her. For a moment, Khalid just stood there, watching. There was something so pure about the way she held his son, stroking his hair gently as she read. It was something he hadn't seen since his wife's passing. Motherly love. And it stirred something deep inside him. When the story ended, Amina looked up and gasped. "Oh, I didn't hear you come in, sir." She quickly stood up, adjusting her dress. "It's fine," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Thank you for taking care of him." She smiled. "He's a wonderful boy. He just needs someone to remind him that he's loved." Khalid didn't know why, but her words struck him hard. He had spent years building his empire, making sure his son would never lack anything, except, perhaps, the one thing that truly mattered. As Amina excused herself to head to her room in the staff quarters, something unexpected happened. Omar refused to let go of her hand. "Stay," the little boy whispered sleepily. Khalid hesitated. He had never seen his son so attached to anyone before. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "You can stay in the guest room next to his for tonight." Amina hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate. but when she looked into Omar's pleading eyes, she nodded. Of course. The next morning, Amina woke up confused. The last thing she remembered was reading to Omar in the guest room, her body exhausted from the long day. But now she was somewhere else. The sheets beneath her were softer than anything she had ever touched. The scent in the air was different, masculine, deep, and familiar. Her heart pounded as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. This wasn't the guest room. This was his room, and she wasn't alone. She turned her head, and there he was, Khalid, sleeping right beside her. Her breath caught in her throat. How had she ended up here? Before she could move, he stirred. His dark lashes fluttered open, and for a moment he simply stared at her. Then his expression changed, from confusion to realization. And then, something else. Khalid's dark eyes locked onto Amina's, and for a brief moment, the world around them felt utterly still. His face, usually composed and unreadable, was now filled with something she couldn't quite decipher. Confusion? Guilt? Something deeper? Amina's breath came in short, shaky intervals as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She sat up abruptly, clutching the silk sheets around her body, even though she was still fully dressed in the clothes she had worn the night before. The realization sent a rush of relief through her, but it did little to calm her pounding heart. How did I get here? Her voice was barely a whisper, her throat dry from the tension. Khalid ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly as if he were trying to gather his thoughts. I don't know. His voice was hoarse, lower than usual. Last night, Omar wouldn't sleep without you. You stayed in the guest room, and I... He hesitated, his brows furrowing in deep thought. I remember checking on both of you. You were asleep. I must have carried you here by mistake. Amina's eyes widened. He had carried her. The thought of his strong arms lifting her, holding her close, sent an unfamiliar warmth through her chest. But she quickly shook the feeling away. This was wrong. She was just a nanny. I should go, she said, forcing herself to move. Before she could swing her legs off the bed, his hand shot out, gently grabbing her wrist. The touch was brief, but it was enough to send a jolt through both of them. Khalid pulled away almost immediately, as if realizing the intimacy of the moment. Amina, he said her name in a way that made her stomach tighten. You're not in trouble. She swallowed hard, nodding as she stood. I understand, but this can't happen again. He didn't answer. He simply watched as she walked toward the door, her bare feet silent against the polished marble floor. Just as she reached for the handle, his voice stopped her. Amina. She turned slightly, refusing to meet his gaze. You've been good to my son. His tone was softer than she had ever heard it before. I wanted to say thank you. The words were simple, yet coming from a man like him, they felt heavier. She nodded, then slipped out of the room before she could allow herself to feel anything more. The moment the door closed behind her, Khalid exhaled, running a hand through his thick, dark hair. What the hell was happening to him? Amina tried to shake off the events of the morning, but the memory of waking up beside Khalid haunted her for the rest of the day. The household staff whispered when they saw her, their eyes filled with unspoken curiosity. She could feel their stares, their silent assumptions. She distracted herself with work, focusing on Omar, making sure he was fed, entertained, and happy. But it was impossible to ignore the way Khalid's presence lingered in her thoughts. That evening, just as she was about to head to the kitchen for dinner, a voice stopped her in the hallway. Miss Amina? She turned to find Layla, the housekeeper, standing with a knowing expression. Layla had been working for Khalid's family long before Amina arrived. She was older, wiser, and observant. Yes? Amina said hesitantly. Layla took a step closer, lowering her voice. Be careful. Amina's stomach twisted. What do you mean? The older woman glanced around, making sure no one was listening. The staff is already talking. They saw you leave his room this morning. It wasn't like that, Amina said quickly, heat rushing to her cheeks. Layla sighed, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. I believe you, child. But the others? They will believe whatever makes the best story. Amina's heart pounded. She couldn't afford a scandal. Not in a house like this. Not when she depended on this job to support her family. I need this job, she whispered. Layla nodded. Then keep your distance. Sheikh Khalid is a powerful man, but power comes with expectations. If anyone suspects something inappropriate... She trailed off, but the warning was clear. Amina nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Thank you for telling me. She turned to leave, but just as she did, she heard a deep, familiar voice from behind her. Miss Amina. Her breath caught. Khalid. She turned around slowly, meeting his intense gaze. Unlike that morning, his expression wasn't confused or uncertain. It was firm, determined. I need to speak with you, he said. Layla stepped back, her eyes shifting between them before giving Amina a final, silent warning. Then she disappeared down the hall, leaving them alone. Amina swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. Yes, sir? He hesitated for a second, then sighed. Come with me. Her heart pounded as she followed him through the grand hallway, past the luxurious chandeliers and golden accents that made up his world. He led her into his private study, closing the door behind them. I need to be honest with you, he said, standing in front of his massive desk. His voice was lower now, almost uncertain. I don't know what happened this morning, but what I do know... He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. Is that I haven't stopped thinking about it. Amina's breath hitched. This couldn't be happening. She couldn't let it happen. But as she stood there, trapped in his gaze, she realized something terrifying. Neither could he. Amina felt like the walls of Khalid's private study were closing in on her. The rich scent of leather and oud filled the space. But it was his presence that made it impossible to breathe. He stood there, his dark eyes locked onto hers, his expression unreadable. I haven't stopped thinking about it, he had just said. His words still lingered in the air between them, heavy, undeniable. Amina's heart pounded in her chest. She had to be careful. She had to choose her next words wisely. Sir, she began, forcing herself to sound calm despite the storm inside her. What happened this morning was a misunderstanding. I didn't mean... I know, Khalid interrupted, his voice controlled but firm. I know you didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. Amina swallowed hard. This couldn't be happening. He was her employer. This was a world she had no place in, a dangerous line neither of them should cross. You are my boss, she said, her voice softer now. And I am the nanny. That is all this is. Khalid's jaw tightened slightly. His gaze never left hers. He took a slow breath, as if choosing his words carefully. You are more than just a nanny, he finally said. Omar adores you. You've brought something into this house that's been missing for a long time. And... He hesitated, something flickering in his eyes. I don't know how to ignore that. Amina's hands clenched into fists. This was exactly what Layla had warned her about. The rumors, the whispers. If anyone found out about this conversation, it would destroy her. I need this job, she said, forcing herself to be strong. I cannot afford to be caught in the middle of anything that might— You think I would put you in danger? Khalid's voice was sharper now, almost offended. That's not what I mean, she whispered. Then what do you mean? She opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. Because deep down, she knew the truth. She was afraid, not of him, not of losing her job, but of how, despite everything, she had also not stopped thinking about him. She forced herself to take a step back. She needed space, distance, anything to keep herself from making a mistake she couldn't undo. If there is nothing else, sir, she said, keeping her voice steady, I need to check on Omar. Khalid studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. You're dismissed. She turned quickly, her hands trembling as she opened the door. But just as she was about to step out, his voice stopped her once more. Amina. She hesitated, but didn't turn around. I don't regret carrying you to my bed, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Her breath caught. I don't regret it, he repeated. Amina shut her eyes for a second, then walked away. The following days were torture. Amina did everything in her power to avoid Khalid. She made sure to only interact with Omar, to take her meals separately from the staff, to never be caught alone in a room with him. She told herself it was for the best. But that didn't stop the whispers. Every time she entered a room, she felt the stares, the hushed voices of the housemaids, the sharp glances from the butlers. Even Layla had taken to watching her carefully, as if waiting for something to happen. It was suffocating. And then it got worse. One afternoon, as Amina walked through the courtyard with Omar, a voice called out to her from behind. She turned to see Zara, Khalid's younger sister. Amina had barely interacted with her before, but she had heard plenty. Zara was beautiful, sharp-tongued, and fiercely protective of her family's reputation. She approached with slow, deliberate steps, her dark eyes cold and calculating. So, she said, folding her arms across her chest, you're the one everyone is talking about. Amina's stomach twisted. I don't know what you mean, Miss Zara, she said carefully. Oh, I think you do. Zara tilted her head slightly, studying her like she was trying to uncover a secret. Tell me, how exactly did you end up in my brother's bed? Amina felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. That's a lie, she said quickly. Zara's smile didn't reach her eyes. Is it? I would never— Of course you wouldn't. Zara's voice was almost mocking. You're just the nanny after all. What could a man like Khalid possibly see in you? The words stung more than Amina wanted to admit. I'm here to take care of Omar, she said firmly. Zara took a step closer. Listen to me carefully, Nanny. My brother is a powerful man. He doesn't make mistakes, and he doesn't break rules. She leaned in, her voice turning icy. You are not an exception. Amina's heart pounded in her chest. I don't want trouble, she whispered. Good, Zara said, straightening. Then stay in your place. She turned and walked away, leaving Amina standing frozen in the courtyard, her hands shaking at her sides. For the first time, Amina truly understood the danger she was in. This wasn't just about her feelings anymore. She had made an enemy, and Zara wasn't the kind of woman to forgive easily. Amina's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the marble fountain in the courtyard, trying to steady herself. Zara's words echoed in her mind, cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. You are not an exception. She had known from the beginning that she didn't belong in Khalid's world, but hearing it from his own sister made the reality even clearer. This wasn't a fairy tale. No matter what had happened that morning in his bed, no matter how his eyes lingered on her, it meant nothing. She was just the nanny, and she had to remind herself of that. Taking a deep breath, she turned back to Omar, who had been playing nearby, blissfully unaware of what had just unfolded. He looked up at her with a bright smile, holding up a small toy car. Miss Amina, look, it's red like Baba's. A lump formed in her throat. Omar was the only reason she was here. She couldn't let anything, or anyone, jeopardize that. That's right, Habibi, she said, forcing a smile. Now, let's get you inside before the sun gets too hot. She took his small hand in hers and led him back toward the house, trying to push Zara's threat to the back of her mind. But the moment they stepped inside, she saw him. Khalid stood at the base of the grand staircase, dressed in a sharp black suit, his phone in one hand. He looked up the moment she entered, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Something passed between them, something she desperately wished she could ignore. She quickly looked away, kneeling beside Omar to adjust his shirt. Go to your room, little one. I'll bring you some juice soon. The boy nodded and ran off, leaving her alone in the vast entry hall. She had no choice but to face Khalid. She straightened, taking a deep breath. I was looking for you, he said, slipping his phone into his pocket. Her heart pounded. For what, sir? His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he motioned for her to follow. Come with me. Amina hesitated. No, this wasn't safe. She needed to keep her distance, but refusing him wasn't an option. She followed him through the house, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this about Zara? Had she already told him about their conversation? Was she about to be fired? He led her into his office, a room she had only been in once before when she was first hired. It was grand, lined with bookshelves and dark wood, a massive desk at the center. The moment the door closed behind them, tension filled the air. Khalid turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Sit. Amina hesitated, but obeyed, sitting stiffly in one of the leather chairs. He walked to his desk, resting his hands on the surface as he studied her. I know Zara spoke to you. Her stomach clenched. So he did know. She lowered her gaze. Sir, Look at me. She swallowed hard before meeting his gaze. She had no right to speak to you that way, he said, his voice firm. Amina blinked, startled. That wasn't what she had expected. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. My sister thinks she knows what's best for me, but she doesn't. She stared at him, trying to understand where this was going. She thinks she's protecting me, he continued. But what she's really doing is interfering in something she doesn't understand. Amina's pulse quickened. And what exactly is that, sir? His jaw tightened. He pushed away from the desk and walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. I told you before. I haven't stopped thinking about you. Amina felt like the air had been sucked from the room. This can't happen, she whispered. Why not? She looked at him incredulously. Because you're Khalid Al-Fayed. And I am a nobody. His expression darkened. Don't ever say that. She clenched her fists. It's the truth. Khalid took another step closer, his voice lower now. If it were just about status, I wouldn't be standing here. Amina's breath came shallow and fast. What do you want from me? She asked, barely able to find her voice. He was quiet for a long moment, as if choosing his next words carefully. I don't know, he admitted. But I know I don't want you to leave. Amina's heart pounded so hard, she thought it might shatter. You're making this impossible, she whispered. Khalid's eyes flickered with something deep, something raw. You think this is easy for me? She wanted to argue, to fight, to tell him that this was all a terrible mistake. But before she could speak, the office door burst open. Zara stood there, her expression furious. Her gaze flicked between them, and a slow, knowing smirk spread across her face. Well, well, she said, stepping inside. What do we have here? Amina shot to her feet, her entire body tense. Miss Zara! Save it! Zara cut her off, her voice dripping with venom. She turned to Khalid. Our father is on his way here. He wants to discuss your future. Her eyes flicked toward Amina, her meaning crystal clear. Amina's heart sank. The Sheikh, Khalid's father, the man who held ultimate power over his life. Zara smiled, sensing Amina's fear. And I wonder, what will he say when he hears about your little Nanny? The threat hung in the air like a loaded gun. Amina knew, in that moment, that everything had changed. She had just become a liability. Amina felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling around her, threatening to pull her into the abyss. Zara's words echoed in her mind, sending an icy chill down her spine. Our father is on his way. And I wonder, what will he say when he hears about your little Nanny? Khalid's father, the Sheikh. Amina had never met him, but she had heard enough to know that he was a man who did not tolerate weakness. He had built an empire, forged a legacy, and ruled with an iron fist. He was the kind of man who dictated his son's future, not one who entertained the idea of a common nanny in his son's life. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Khalid, however, remained calm. His expression didn't change. His body didn't tense. He simply turned to his sister and spoke in a voice so cold it sent shivers down Amina's spine. You think this intimidates me? He said, his tone like steel. Zara smirked. Oh, brother, I think we both know it's not me you should be worried about. She cast one last sharp glance at Amina before turning and walking out of the office, her heels clicking against the marble floors. The moment she was gone, Amina let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Khalid, she whispered, panic seeping into her voice. His dark eyes met hers, softer than before. Don't be afraid. How can I not be? She said, shaking her head. Your father, if he finds out... He won't, Khalid said firmly. And even if he does, I will handle it. His confidence should have reassured her, but instead, it only made her stomach twist. This isn't just about us, she said. Your family, your reputation, your business. You have everything to lose. He took a step closer, his voice lower now. And what about you, Amina? What do you have to lose? She swallowed hard, her throat tight. Everything. For the first time, Khalid looked uncertain, like he hadn't considered what this would mean for her. I won't let anything happen to you, he said. She wanted to believe him, but she also knew that some battles weren't meant to be fought. A knock at the door made them both tense. A guard stepped inside, his posture rigid. Sir, your father has arrived. Amina's blood ran cold. Khalid's jaw clenched. Where is he? In the main sitting room. He's waiting for you. Khalid nodded. I'll be there shortly. The guard hesitated before adding, He brought a guest. Khalid's eyes darkened. Who? The guard hesitated, then spoke carefully. Zayed bin Rashid al-Maktoum. Silence. Amina didn't know the name, but judging by the way Khalid's entire body went rigid, she could guess. Understood, Khalid finally said, dismissing the guard. The moment they were alone, Amina asked, Who is Zayed? Khalid exhaled slowly. My father's closest ally, and the man he's been trying to arrange my marriage with his daughter for the last 2 years. Amina's stomach dropped. Of course, a man like Khalid wouldn't be free to love whoever he wanted. Her worst fear had just become reality. She was nothing but a distraction. You should go, he said suddenly. She looked up at him. What? I need to handle this, and I don't want you anywhere near it. She hesitated. Khalid, go, Amina, he said, his voice softer this time. Please. Her heart ached, but she nodded. Be careful. She turned and walked away, knowing deep down that this was the beginning of the end. The sitting room was grand, adorned with gold-trimmed furniture, high ceilings, and a chandelier that dripped with elegance. But despite its beauty, the air was thick with tension. Sheikh Hassan al-Fayed sat at the head of the room, his presence commanding without him having to say a word. His sharp features, graying beard, and piercing gaze were enough to make most men tremble. But Khalid had long stopped fearing his father. Across from him sat Zayed, a man just as powerful, but with a cruel glint in his eyes. Khalid entered the room, his posture unyielding. Father. The sheikh looked up, nodding once in acknowledgement. Khalid. Zayed smiled. It's been too long, old friend. Khalid didn't return the smile. What brings you here? His father leaned back, his fingers intertwined. A discussion about your future. Khalid already knew where this was going. He had no interest in marrying Zayed's daughter. He had made that clear before. But his father was relentless. Lena is waiting in the car, Zayed said casually. She's eager to see you again. Khalid clenched his jaw. I see no reason for this conversation, he said coolly. I have no plans to marry. His father's expression darkened. You will. No. The room went still. The sheikh's eyes narrowed. And why is that? Khalid knew that if he answered honestly, if he told them about Amina, he would be putting her in danger. So he lied. I have no interest in marriage, to anyone. Zayed chuckled, swirling the drink in his glass. That's funny, because the staff tells a different story. Khalid's blood turned to ice. His father's gaze sharpened. Who is she? For the first time, Khalid hesitated. Zayed smirked. Ah, so there is someone. Silence stretched between them. Khalid knew he had just made the biggest mistake of all. Now, they would never stop until they found her. And once they did, Amina's life would never be the same. Amina sat on the edge of her bed, hands trembling. The mansion felt suffocating now, every hallway filled with whispers, every glance loaded with suspicion. She had to leave. But before she could move, the door swung open. Khalid stood there, his eyes dark with urgency. Pack your things, he said. Amina's heart stopped. What? My father knows, he said. He doesn't know it's you, yet. But it won't be long before he finds out. Her hands clenched. I have nowhere to go. Khalid stepped closer. I'll take care of everything, but we have to move now. Amina searched his face. She wanted to believe him, but deep down she knew that once she left, there would be no turning back. Still, she nodded. Okay. The black SUV sped through the desert roads, leaving Dubai's skyline behind. Amina sat in the passenger seat, gripping her bag tightly. Where are we going? Khalid kept his eyes on the road. Somewhere safe. Her chest ached. I don't want you to ruin your life for me. He exhaled sharply. You think my life means anything without you? Amina blinked, stunned. Before she could answer, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Too close, too fast. Khalid cursed under his breath. A black Mercedes was chasing them. Amina's stomach twisted. Is that? My father's men, Khalid muttered. Then the Mercedes rammed into them. The SUV swerved violently. Khalid fought for control. Hold on, he shouted. Another hit. The tires screeched. Amina's heart pounded as the car spun off the road, crashing into the sand. Everything went dark. When she opened her eyes, Khalid was pulling her out of the wreck. A shadow loomed over them. Zayed. You really thought you could run, Khalid? Amina gasped as two men grabbed her. No, Khalid roared, but they overpowered him. Zayed smirked. She's not yours to keep. Then the world blurred as Amina was dragged away. Amina sat in a lavish room, trapped. Zayed entered, smug. You will leave Dubai tonight. Alone. Her chest ached. And Khalid? He'll come to his senses, Zayed said, or he'll lose everything. Tears burned her eyes. Then the door burst open. Khalid stood there, bruised but furious. You'll have to kill me before you take her, he growled. Zayed laughed. You'd throw away your empire for a nanny? Khalid didn't hesitate. Yes. Amina's breath hitched. Zayed sighed, stepping aside. Then she's yours. Khalid grabbed her hand. Let's go. As they walked out, Amina squeezed his fingers. You really gave up everything? She whispered. Khalid looked at her, his eyes soft. For you, always. And with that, they disappeared into the night, together.